Hey, what's up? Welcome back. Alright, let's get back into this finale of the story of Alexander the Great. Okay, now it is in the late spring of the 7th year after crossing into Asia. All the nonsense was done, and Alexander got to leave Bactria to begin his invasion of India. He crossed the mountains to the south, reaching the city of Alexandria he founded in the Kabul Valley. He stayed for a bit and replaced a governor there. Side note, Alexander is usually portrayed as just a conqueror and soldier and couldn't care less about governing stuff, but he did actually spend a fair bit of his empire. Now whether he made smart choices for those things is debatable, but he still cared, just not as much as conquest and fighting. Anyways, Alexander began continuing on through the Kabul Valley. On his march, he was being met by various local kings from India that pledged allegiance, an important one being from the city of Taxila. That king gave Alexander 25 battle elephants as a gift. At this point, Alexander then divided his army in two and sent Hephaestion with a big force east across the Khyber Pass, telling him to subdue rebel tribes along the way. And more importantly, hurry as quick as possible to reach the Indus and build a bridge for the rest of the army to cross. So Alexander and the remainder of the army headed northeast into the mountains to subdue some highland tribes. The history records of this little trek to subdue highland tribes are pretty much all the same. Alexander would declare that they all surrender, the citizens were like nah, inhabitants were slaughtered, then just repeat the process for the next city. At last, Alexander came down from the high mountains and arrived at the Indus, finding that Hephaestion finished the bridge of boats to cross the wide river. Just across was India, a mythic land barely known to the Greek world. Alexander and his army crossed the Indus and continued south to the city of Taxila while being sent gifts from the ruler along the way. Once near the city, Alexander saw the army and elephants from Taxila in battle formation, so he called everyone to arms. The king of Taxila, King Omphis, saw this, halted his men, and rode out to Alexander in the traditional manner, and that he was actually surrendering everything to Alexander. Alexander was like, oh, okay, then gave everything that Omphis just gave him back to him to solidify their good faith and whatnot. And with that out of the way, Alexander proceeded to enter the city of Taxila. Though the city lacked any architecture grandeur, it was made up for by kind reception and gifts. After days of feasting and banquets, Omphis and Alexander finally could talk business. Omphis was in a continual war with his neighbors, including one very powerful kingdom to the south beyond the Hydaspes, ruled by a king called Porus, to expand his empire with the help of Alexander, and it looked rather promising. Even an envoy sent from Porus to Alexander eventually arrived at Taxila with news. The message, however, was nothing good. King Porus sent word that he would not pay any tribute to Alexander, but would be more than happy to meet him at the Hydaspes with an army ready for battle. That was unfortunate news for Alexander, who wanted a quick and peaceful march through India. He knew Porus had a large army, including over 100 war elephants, which would make things pretty tough. Win, he was still sure he could do, but with it being monsoon season and having to fight in this new and odd terrain, it surely would not be easy. But despite the constant rains, Alexander set off his wet army to the Hydaspes in the south. After a few days, they came to a pass leading down to the plain of the Hydaspes. From this they gazed at the vast Punjab plain, Ganges River. Below they could see the Hydaspes River, almost a mile wide and wicked fast. On the other side was Porus. Accompanied by a smaller force than Alexander, but that force knew the terrain, the weather, and had elephants, of course. Alexander, taking a look at the force and the river, sent the men back to the Indus to dismantle the pontoon bridge and bring the boats to him in pieces. Meanwhile, the king made camp on the north bank of the river and strategized on how he might cross the river undetected. Sending scouts up to the river, they eventually found a place to cross. Boats were at last ready. Alexander left Craterus in charge of the main camp opposite Porus with a strong force. Then in darkness, Alexander led his toughest troops silently across the river. At this point, word reached Porus of a Macedonian force to his east. He had to decide what to do. There are now men opposite of him and to the east. So he decided to leave a small force and some elephants in place across from Craterus while he moved toward Alexander with his main force. Alexander surveyed the enemy's army as they approached. He decided to deploy a classic envelopment tactic. He sent his cavalry to the left and right with ordnance while the main army attacked from the front. And what followed was a brutal battle, savagely fought in mud and blood with heavy losses on both sides. And most unfortunate of all, Alexander's horse Bucephalus was mortally wounded and after years of fighting, passed. As the fighting continued, eventually the Indians began to break, and at that moment Craterus crossed the river to cut off any retreat. Soon enough it seemed that it was only Porus left waging battle atop his war elephant. Alexander was so impressed, he sent messengers begging the guy to surrender. One of those messengers eventually was able to persuade the king to surrender and lay down his arms. Then the two rulers, Porus and Alexander, met. Alexander would have surely been impressed at Porus demounting his elephant and the fact that the guy was pretty large and well over 6 feet. The two talked and the battle was over. Alexander treated Porus like a king. Alexander then did the usual and held funeral rites, offered sacrifices, and held an athletic game to celebrate and honor their victory. Then, in memory of the Bucephalus, he founded a city near the site of the battle in the name of the horse. And with that battle behind him, he planned to build a navy and sail down the Hydaspes to the Indus, then followed the river to the sea, subduing kingdoms along the way. Since this project would take months, he told his men they were going to conquer eastern India. And with this plan in motion, he set off to the cities near the borders of Porus. He conquered those easily and gave them to Porus. Then he advanced to the Hydrates, where he submitted the locals pretty easily. Beyond the Hydrates was the land of the Cathayans, who were warlike people with the city of Sangala as their capital. Yet again, Alexander's men broke through their city, conquering them as well. He noticed the pattern and quickly surrendered, giving him hospitality and rest in his kingdom. And by now, weeks of fighting across the Punjab had passed, and Alexander's army was tired. But he pushed them on to the Hyphasis, the last of the great rivers of the Punjab, where the Indian rulers there surrendered to Alexander. That ruler told Alexander, ruled by a guy named Xandrames, who possessed some crazy amounts of soldiers. 200,000 infantry, 20,000 cavalry, and over 4,000 war elephants. And that only made Alexander excited, and he desired to conquer what no one else had even dared attempt. But his army was exhausted and did not want to continue. So Alexander tried giving another one of his motivating speeches that worked time and time again before, and it was a good speech again, but it did not have the intended effect. His men just fell silent. Only Coenus, Alexander's most senior surviving general, spoke up. He spoke for the entire army, telling Alexander what an honor it has been to go so far. But they were exhausted, seen so many friends die, and longed for home. He urged Alexander to return to Macedonia, then he could lead back a new generation of soldiers for future glorious victories. But for this, prompted cheer from the army. Alexander became furious though, and stormed off to his tent, not being seen for 3 full days. But eventually, the king had to accept what his men wanted. And once again, Alexander addressed his army and declared that they were all going home. And soon enough, with one last wishful glance to the east, long march back home. The onset of the journey back home started by going to the Hydaspes and was pretty uneventful, apart from the arrival of 30,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and wagon loads of medical supplies from Greece. And not to mention 25,000 sets of armor inlaid with gold and silver sent from his treasurer Harpalus. And that last bit the men actually appreciated because at this point their army is practically degraded to nothing. And apart from that, one sad thing did happen though, and that was that the old Coenus, this guy who convinced him to go back home, ended up passing away, though seemingly of natural causes. So by the time the army arrived at the Hydaspes, the king was totes excited. The fleet was finally ready. Over 1,000 ships, including large warships, horse transport, and cargo vessels. On those ships were plenty of seafaring Phoenicians, Cypriots, Carians, and Egyptians to serve as sailors. And as well, Alexander's friend Nearchus was going to serve as admiral. Despite so many ships, there was still not enough room for most of Alexander's army, so Alexander sent Hephaestion and Craterus to lead the rest of the army on opposite banks, following the fleet. And soon enough, with the travel plans in place, everyone was off. Even the local Indians cheered and sang songs in celebration when they were departing, though probably because they're more than happy to see them leave. Now picture this. You're Alexander the Great, land of India, and headed back home on your ancient version of a luxury yacht. For once in a lifetime, you can relax and just catch some rays. And that's what Alexander did for the first few days. He got the rare luxury to just sit on his ship while he gently drifted down the river. He even spent some of his time listening to an old friend, Aristobulus, read some of the history from the expedition. The Greek writer, on one occasion, recited aloud to Alexander, recalling events from the fight with Porus. In his version, Alexander fought in glorious single combat with the Indian king, and Alexander, taking a break from his suntanning, stood up, grabbed the book, and threw it into the river, saying, "He should toss overboard the man who wrote such nonsense as well." And that goes to show you, whether you say the right thing or wrong thing to Alexander, you never know what kind of response you'll actually get from the guy. Alright, by now it has been 5 days and Alexander has a great base tan. His fleet came to the junction of the two rivers, Hydaspes and Acesines, where the two flowed into one single channel that produced whirlpools and quick currents. So all the ships began to enter the channel and they started off okay. Small ships turned out to be fine, but the larger ones were tossed around, turning sideways and running into one another. So, the tough and rugged soldiers on the ships, who bravely had faced barbarians and giant elephants, were now screaming in terror as they were thrown into the water. Alexander even panicked jumping into the water. My dude couldn't swim though. So yeah, one of his friends had to leap in and save him. Alexander was so grateful, he immediately sacrificed to the gods to say thanks for not drowning me. And after a little rest, he even joked about it with his men, saying he now won a contest of strength against the river. Next, after they had repaired all the ships that just got damaged, Alexander sent Nearchus to the next river juncture while Alexander and a lot of the army marched to the realm of Mali, a feared tribe in the Punjab. These Indians were prepared for Macedonian arrival actually, but only by river. And so, in Alexander fashion, he would do the unexpected and sneak up on the tribe from behind at night. He stormed the walls and seized the citadel, killing all 2,000 natives who had taken refuge there. Any runaways were hunted down and slaughtered in the surrounding marshes. Then a second and third city soon followed. Alexander arrived at that last city near sunset and put his army in battle formation. The natives were so terrified they all retreated further into their city, into the citadel. The Macedonians then went right on through the gates, but couldn't figure out how to breach into the citadel where everyone went. Alexander, the not-so-patient, became angry rather quickly. So he grabbed a ladder, held his shield in front of him, and began to mount the wall, with his attendant Pusestis close behind. He was followed by Leonatus, his bodyguard, and Abraeus, a common soldier. Alexander reached the top of the wall and started fighting off Mali if the three climbed up. The rest of the soldiers below then tried scurrying up the ladder at the same time and, well, it broke right away due to all their weight. So now Alexander and the three men were up there with no clear exit. Alexander then decided to cast caution in the wind and jumped off the top of the wall and further into the citadel to stab anyone who approached him, killing several Mali defenders. The Mali then began to form a semicircle around Alexander and closed in. At this time, the three men who climbed up with Alexander saw what was happening and leapt down. Abraeus, the common soldier, died instantly by an arrow to the face, and then Alexander was shot with an arrow that penetrated his armor, went into his chest, puncturing a lung. He still fought on though and was standing his ground, but he soon collapsed out of the struggle to breathe and the loss of blood. All that remained was his bodyguard Leonatus and his attendant Pusestis. They struggled to defend their king while the rest of the Macedonians struggled their way in. They pushed and pushed on the gate until finally the bar holding it snapped. Then in a hurry they reached Alexander, seeing him lay collapsed in a pool of his own blood. Then in a fury for what they saw happen to their king, the Macedonians cut down every man, woman, and child, carried to his nearby ship. There, the arrow in his chest was removed and he began to hemorrhage profusely until he slipped into unconsciousness. With the king in the state he was, rumors started to run through the army that he was dead. As days passed with no Alexander, the men were in despair. But as the days moved along, at last they got word of his appearance. Then at last, Alexander was seen, carried on a litter down a ship's ramp. He would have looked half dead, but he still managed to wave to the crowd awaiting his presence. They shouted and cried in happiness that he was still alive. After more time passed, Alexander started to recover. While resting and healing, he ordered more boats to be constructed. Once they were complete, and Alexander was better, he once again loaded thousands onto the boats while the rest marched along the banks. Setting sail, the fleet at last reached the Indus, and at the final juncture of the rivers, he founded another Alexandria. Several weeks drifted by, and at last the army arrived at the city of Patala, where the Indus split into two branches. Here, Alexander split his army into three parts. The first under Craterus would march northwest overland back to Kandahar and join Alexander in Persia. He would take all the elephants and all the veterans. The second under Nearchus would set sail on the coast all the way to the Persian Gulf as soon as winds were more favorable. Alexander would lead the main force back to Persepolis by a southern route through the Gedrosian desert. Now after 10 years in Asia, the king was anxious to begin the journey back. Craterus had already left, but the fleet with Nearchus had to wait for favorable winds. So the impatient king said adios to Nearchus and told him to explore the northern part of the Great Ocean and look for rendezvous points along the coast where Alexander's army would have dug freshwater wells. Alexander could now be on his merry way through the Gedrosian desert, but I don't know why he was in such a hurry to march through a place where nothing good happens. Some historians say he actually chose the Gedrosian desert because he wanted to punish his army for not letting him keep conquesting, but that's pretty stupid. Like, he can be petty and vindictive as hell, but he wouldn't kill off his men for that reason. What is more believable is probably this. First and foremost, he chose that route because he wanted to keep in contact with the fleet as it moved through the ocean. That exploration was essential for future plans Alexander had for trade and conquest. And second, but probably more important to Alexander, is that no one had done it before. Back from India through the wasteland that is that desert, it would just be another victory for him. And so, Alexander, with his 50,000 plus entourage, left the Indus River in late summer 326 and began their march. As Alexander and the army marched west, the beginning land and climate were just peachy. The army had food, water, all seemed decent. But as they continued, there was still no sign of Nearchus in the fleet. Food was running out, and so was water. As days of little food and water turned to weeks, men began to drop. Hundreds, then thousands from sickness, heat stroke, and thirst. At this point, everyone had pretty much given up hope of escaping the desert alive. So Alexander decided to take another shot at looking out to the sea, hoping to find his friend and admiral, Nearchus. He was nowhere to be seen yet again, but the army did manage to dig wells for enough supply for another week of travel. Alexander, losing hope that he'd ever see the fleet again, thought they must have been lost at sea. He felt that he condemned the whole navy to death. But Alexander had a lot more to feel sorry for right where he was. Perhaps half his soldiers had died in the desert, and almost all civilians who had followed them had been lost to the sands. So in a final push, Alexander moved away from the sea, going 100 miles north to a little town called Porta on the road to Persepolis. When the Macedonians arrived, they were welcomed and provided food, water, and rest. Once everyone got their needed rest and were refueled, the place was almost 500 miles away, but at least the route there was no desert of death. It had adequate resources for the army to march with relative ease. So back at it again, everyone was off. Making their way through the land of Carmania near the Strait of Hormuz, Alexander was met by Craterus and his contingent. It was also near the straits that a small recognized them, though they carried themselves like Macedonians. The leader of these men spoke, declaring he was Nearchus, and asked to be led to Alexander. Nearchus, looking a little homeless, was brought forth to Alexander and told him of his journey. He dealt with terrible weather, island natives, thirst, hunger, and just about all the sort of bad things that could happen. Alexander was just overjoyed at seeing him, and learning that the fleet was safely harbored just a few days away certainly helped. After sacrifices of Thanksgiving, Nearchus rested and was to be off again on the remainder of the voyage to Susa with the fleet. Alexander, thankful he had such a man to serve with, made sure he had plenty of supplies and was sent him off. And now we're at a point where almost 6 years have passed after leaving Persia and a full decade since leaving Europe. At last, Alexander had returned to the heartland of his empire just as winter was descending onto Persepolis. When Alexander had left Persepolis after first entering the city years ago, he was just 26 years old. Now he was in his early 30s, that odd age where you're too old for Snapchat but too young for Life Alert. Alexander used his time in Persepolis to establish some better control over his empire. A lot of administration stuff had become rather lax, and it was time for them to kick it into high gear. After dealing out some fun governmental type justice, he then made his way from Persepolis to Susa in Mesopotamia. On his journey, Alexander was brimming with plans for the future. Seeing everything he now controlled did not make him feel accomplished or content. Of conquering Arabia, even though it offered little more than sand, the coastal cities would be a great collection. He dreamed of retracing the Phoenician voyage he had read of in Herodotus and circumnavigating Africa. He dreamed of his next steps of expansion into the west, conquering North Africa, and to lay waste the potential rising power who called themselves the Romans. Once finished in the west, he would perhaps go back east, complete the conquest of Scythia, explore the lands, and set his eyes once again back toward India. If the gods granted Alexander enough time, he would create the times, encompassing Europe, Africa, and Asia. But dreaming set aside, Alexander reached Susa that winter. He held a mass wedding, another attempt to integrate Macedonians and the natives of his empire. Alexander took 2 Persian brides, a daughter of Darius and a daughter of the former great king Artaxerxes. He bestowed another daughter of Darius to Hephaestion, so their future kids could be cousins and have crazy family reunions. Craterus received a sister of Alexander's first wife, Roxanne, while Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Nearchus, Seleucus, and dozens of others were also given brides. Just one big, happy family. So the grand ceremony was extravagant and really just a great show and noble effort on Alexander's part on trying to bring together parts of his homeland and his empire. The Macedonians, of course, did what they were told and took foreign brides, but all the officers really wanted a Macedonian wife, a lot more among the common soldiers rather than the higher-ranking ones. Apart from the mass weddings, though, Alexander moved north to Opis. There, those 30,000 Persians who were taught Greek and Macedonian warfare showed up. That prompted Alexander to decommission all older and/or hurt veterans to return home, with their bonuses, of course. He announced this decommissioning of many to return home, believing that the news would be met with joy. But the forced marriages, the new Persian troops, and the sending of honored Macedonians back home, all was a bit too much. Instead of cheer and applause, many shouts arose that they should all be sent home because now Alexander had his natives to fight for him. And that made Alexander furious. He ordered his guards to arrest the agitators and then took stage to give another one of his famous speeches of sorts. This one is definitely the speech he's known for, though. Just Google Alexander's speech at Opis for the whole thing. It's actually pretty awesome. This is more or less what he said, though. Impassionately, he chastised the men for their ingratitude, reminding them that they were nothing but goat herders before Philip turned them into soldiers. Under Philip, they became powerful and feared throughout the Balkan area. They created an empire from Europe to Africa and to Asia. They had become rich men while he kept no luxury for himself. He ate the same food they did, fought in the same battles. He paid their debts, honored their dead, and anything they had asked, he granted. He then shouted at everyone to get out of his sight. Everyone could go home. He told them to just make sure that they told their families back home that they deserted their king, handing him and the empire over to the barbarians. Alexander then left the stage and retired to his tent for 3 days, refusing to see a soul. And soon enough, his men began to beg to see him. They would wait days, met by an old cavalry Macedonian named Kylinis, who spoke for all the men. He pleaded with Alexander to not send all the men home. They could not bear to see Alexander embrace Persians while they were shunned. Alexander then embraced the man and welcomed everyone back. All was forgiven. Only those who were truly unable to fight were sent back home with money for all their servitude. And he would send his faithful friend Craterus to accompany them home. And with that disaster averted, the intense summer heat was fast approaching, so Alexander did what great kings before him had done: retreat to the royal capital of Ecbatana to cool off in Media. In Ecbatana, he thought he might as well try to chill and boost the morale of his men after everything that just went down. He did so by throwing athletic and musical competitions for his men during the day and drinking parties at night for his friends. Thousands of actors and artists from all over Greece came, and these things were fun, at least at the start. During one of the nights, after one party, Alexander's closest friend Hephaestion fell ill with a fever, so he went to his physician, Glaucias, to see what was up. Glaucias then advised 7 days of bed rest and to quit drinking and eating so much. So he did that, and when the 7 days were up, Glaucias was confident the worst of the fever was behind him and he'd be fine. So the physician left for the theater, and Hephaestion ran straight to the dining room. Probably starving and craving some sweet alcohol, he ate a whole boiled chicken and drank an entire container of chilled wine. He immediately collapsed on the floor. Lightweight. Well, some good people that were just chilling around rushed to help him and got him back to his bed. Alexander quickly got word of what had happened and ran to Hephaestion's side. But by the time Alexander arrived at the bedside, Hephaestion, his closest friend and dearest love, was dead. Although his 5 stages of grief looked a bit different than ours would have. So he skipped stage 1 denial and went straight to stage 2 anger. He quickly crucified the physician Glaucias, blaming him for improper care. Then he ordered all manes and tails of horses and mules to be cut short as a token of mourning. Then he commanded that all music cease and the temple be burned down. After stage 2, Alexander then skipped stage 3 of bargaining and went to stage 4 depression. Over the next day, he wept and mourned alone over his dead friend, too depressed to eat or even drink. He only stopped once his companions came to carry him away. Recuperating himself a bit, Alexander, in reminiscence of Achilles mourning Patroclus, he cut his hair and drove the body of Hephaestion himself into the funeral procession. Alexander then sent to the oracle at Siwan, Egypt, if Hephaestion could be honored as a god, but that was too much for the priest to endorse. Alexander settled for that, and ordered shrines to be constructed in Egypt and elsewhere. He also commanded a tomb to be built for Hephaestion. It would be in the shape of a Babylonian ziggurat, with a base more than 600 feet square and ascending levels 200 feet in height. Only the best artists were used for its decoration, which included carvings of archers, animal hunts, and eagles. On the monument itself was gold and impressive ships, lions and bulls, and sirens. It was surely something that rivaled the most expensive and lavish tombs from anywhere in the world. And with the monument stuff finished, Alexander still mourned. It had been some time at this point since Hephaestion's death, but he continued mourning as the seasons changed to winter. Everyone was thinking that they had to find a way to get Alexander out of his depression. How to get Alexander into the stage 5 of acceptance. Well, a better way to turn his mood around than some military action. Luck would have it that a rebellious tribe called the Kosaeans in southwest Ecbatana were causing havoc and needed someone to teach them a lesson. Fortunately, the chance at battle was enough to get Alexander out of bed. In a renewed spirit, he was ready to teach these people a lesson. He and Ptolemy surrounded Kosaean lands and isolated their villages. They launched a series of attacks for 40 days, declaring that every Kusain slain was an offering to the spirit of Hephaestion. And after 40 days of that, few Kusains even survived, prompting their leaders to sue for peace and agreed to become subject people of Alexander. And finally, it seemed that Alexander was on his way to stage 5 acceptance. Slowly realizing that the dead are gone but not forgotten, and the living must go on living. With that business now being done, spring was starting to begin and the Zagros Mountains started to bloom with flowers. Thus at last, Alexander began his march from Ecbatana to Babylon. Along the way, envoys from all over came to congratulate him on his conquests, and more notably try to express their hopes of being friends rather than enemies. There were ambassadors from Africa, the Carthaginians came, tribes of Italy like the Etruscans, and ambassadors as the Iberians and the Scythians as well. Among many others, some of them the king had met before and some were new people. Regardless, he welcomed them all with kind assurances of friendship, but along with a promise that he could break that peace in the future if he wanted to. And continuing on his journey to Babylon, he drew nearer and nearer. And at last he saw the walls of the city. Outside the walls, he was met by a group of Chaldean priests who begged him not to enter. They had received an oracle from the great god Bel-Marduk, warning that the king should avoid Babylon at all costs. Alexander did respect these Chaldean people. He was suspicious of them and their motives. Alexander was still a man of the times though, and a bit superstitious, so he tried to make light of the prophecy and quoted the Chaldeans a line from the playwright Euripides, that the best prophet is one who guesses well. The Chaldeans saw that he wasn't going to listen, so then they told him to at least not enter the city facing west in the setting sun, the universal symbol of death in the ancient world. So Alexander listened and led his men around to approach the town from the opposite side, which took a few days going through swamps and marsh-type areas. After that little trek, Alexander was now through the city gates and inside Babylon. But soon enough, ill omens began to happen. One of his friends, who was sacrificing on his behalf, saw that the animal was discovered to have a malformed liver, and that's always a no bueno sign. Another day, ravens fought with one another above Alexander's head, and some fell dead at his feet. The largest and most majestic lion in his private zoo was attacked by a tame donkey and kicked to death. And that was enough for Alexander to feel like he should briefly leave the city. So a few days later, he sailed along the river, guiding the boat himself, accompanied by a few sailors. He sailed past flooded tombs of ancient Assyrian kings, when suddenly a wind out of nowhere came and snatched the crown off his head. The crown flew off into a reed growing out of an old tomb. So one of the sailors jumped to retrieve it for him. The sailor got the crown but couldn't swim back holding it, so he placed it atop his own head and swam back to rescue the crown, but then he was also punished for daring to place it on his head. Alexander was nearly convinced that it was an instinctive warning to show he was in danger of losing his crown permanently. And if botched sacrifices, dead animals, or losing your crown is not enough prophetic wisdom, the worst of them came one day when Alexander was exercising and the weather was super hot, so Alexander took off his robes and put them on the back of a nearby throne. When he was finished, he turned around and saw a man sitting on this chair wearing all his royal attire and crown. Alexander had the man immediately tortured to question him. His name was Dionysius, and he hailed from the Greek city of Messenia near Sparta. He said he was a prisoner bound in chains until a god came to free him, bidding him to put on Alexander's attire and sit silently on his throne. But instead of being outright fearful or mad, he simply thought back to a Babylonian custom he learned, where a condemned criminal acted as a substitute king for a day to draw down the wrath of the gods onto himself and spare the real king. So Alexander took this as if it were some good luck and had the man executed, hoping that it might satisfy the gods. I guess we'll find out. As May turned to June, Alexander was busy with plans for an upcoming expedition to Arabia. Hundreds of ships were on their final fitting and the crews were drilled. It would be a grand expedition down the Persian Gulf and through the Straits, then around the southern shore of the peninsula, seizing the lands of frankincense and myrrh, then up the Red Sea to Egypt. Alexander could not wait to start. Days of his expedition planning would be followed by nights of drinking parties in true fashion. so pretty much everyone got blocked out drunk and could not find their way back to their beds. On one evening, the king held a feast for his admiral Nearchus, and when finished, he started heading home. But he was met up by this dude, Medius, a friend from Thessaly who was like, "You Alexander, let's go out." Two and a few others drank late into the night and had some fun. Alexander, the next day, still got up super early despite last night's drinking and performed his daily sacrifices. And as the day passed and night came again, he was back at it with Medius. This time they were drinking in celebration to honor Hercules, so Alexander could not miss it. Drinks were flowing, and as the night went on, Alexander had the idea to drink an entire beaker of unmixed wine in a gulp. Immediately though, he looked as if he got hit by the ancient equivalent of a truck. So, like an elephant, maybe? Anyways, his friends rushed him to his bed to rest. The next morning, he started to come down with a fever, but regardless, still did his sacrifices. Still sick, he then issued orders to the fleet concerning the departure for Arabia that was supposed to happen a few days hence, and commanded the infantry to be ready a day before the sailing. Well, the next day came, and he was still sickly and weak. He didn't do much else, and that night he just laid awake with a high fever. And yet again, he got up the next morning to do sacrifices and spoke to Nearchus about the fleet. Some more days passed of early morning sacrifices and nights of feverish sweat with no sleep. At this point, his generals already left his side. It had begun to spread among the army that the king was gravely ill. Alexander heard these rumors himself and ordered the soldiers admitted to his presence to see him. Men began filing past his bed in silence, and were filled with tears as Alexander faintly nodded to every one of them. No one could bear to think that the great King Alexander might die here in Babylon. In a bed. After all, Alexander was the man who outwitted death at just about every turn. Alexander's fever raged on though, the pain increasing, and soon, even Alexander, just short of his 33rd birthday, knew that the end was near. He took off he might temporarily act as regent, but the ultimate succession was unclear. His wife, Roxanne, was pregnant and he hoped it would be a boy, though he wouldn't come of age for a long time and only be partly Macedonian. The whole situation could turn to chaos for the empire if Alexander did not make his wishes clear. So at last, his companions approached his bedside and implored him to name his successor. "Who do you leave your kingdom to?" They leaned in close to hear his words, and with great effort, Alexander whispered, "To the strongest." And with that, the king breathed his last breath. There it is, the story and the life of Alexander the Great, the man whose empire stretched from Macedonia to the Indus River, the man who fought bravely alongside his soldiers, and the man who cheated death a dozen times. The legacy of Alexander is one that could never really be forgotten. All the places he had been would remember him, from Asia Minor and Egypt to Persia and India. He left a cultural imprint on the world that could not be erased. And whether it was the city of Alexandria in Egypt, the spreading of Hellenic ideas, or his military prowess, he accomplished more at 32 than most ever would in their lives. His accomplishment influences on history are really unparalleled, and whether he did it as a good guy or bad guy doesn't really diminish anything he did. You know enough about Alexander to decide what kind of guy he really was. A murderous tyrant with a gift for generalship? A clever but childish megalomaniac? Or the embodiment of ambition, with all the good and evil that comes with it? You can decide what kind of guy he was. But in the end, we can't help but admire a guy who dared to do great things and risk it all to do them. So, thanks for watching the story of Alexander the Great. Hope you learned something about the character of Alexander the Great and more than just the battles he was in. If you want more videos on some cool historical figures that have really unique personalities and do a lot more than what they're known for, hit the subscribe button to stay updated and comment something below that you learned or would like a video on. So thanks for watching.